The half-finished sign lay across two sawhorses in the thin morning light, the pine smelling sharp and clean. Arthur Vance dipped his brush into the pot of black paint, the bristles stiff from the dry Wyoming air. For words were done, for sale. Inquire within. He had just enough paint for the last part, cheap. That one word felt like the truest part of the whole affair. He was selling his claim, his small herd, and the 3 years of sweat he'd poured into the ungrateful soil, and he was doing it for whatever he could get. The life he'd imagined here, a quiet penance of hard work and solitude, had soured into simple loneliness. There was nothing left to do but leave. He was about to paint the sea when a sound drifted over the low rise to the east. It wasn't the familiar clatter of a supply wagon from Dusty Creek, nor the rhythmic plodding of Jebediah Thorne's cattle moving to new pasture. This was a lighter sound, the complaint of a single axle turning too slowly, pulled by an animal that was tired to its bones. Arthur set the brush down and walked to the edge of his porch, his hand resting on the weathered rail. A lone wagon, its canvas cover gray with dust, was inching its way toward the abandoned Miller homestead next to his. The place had been empty for a year, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the valley. The wagon stopped. The dust settled. For a long moment, nothing happened. Arthur squinted against the sun. He expected a family, gaunt and weary from the trail, or perhaps a speculator from back east who'd bought the deed site unseen. But when the canvas flap was pushed aside, only one person emerged. It was a woman, and she was alone. She wore a simple, high-collared dress of gray fabric that fell straight to her ankles, a style he'd never seen before. It was not the calico or gingham of the women in town. It was severe, yet graceful. She moved with a deliberate economy, climbing down from the wagon seat and walking to the head of the tired-looking mule that stood drooping in the harness. She stroked its nose, her movement slow and calming. From this distance, he couldn't see her face clearly, but he could see her posture. It was straight, unbent by the journey. She was small-framed, yet there was nothing fragile about the way she began to unhitch the mule. She worked methodically, her hands knowing exactly what to do. He watched as she led the animal to the dry creek bed that separated their properties, letting it drink from the few stagnant pools that remained in the summer heat. Arthur felt a prickle of something he couldn't name. Annoyance, perhaps. A neighbor meant complications, and he was done with complications. His plan was simple: sell the ranch, ride west until he hit the ocean, and find a place where the name Arthur Vance meant nothing at all. A lone woman, especially one who looked so out of place, was a problem waiting to happen. She would need help. She would have questions. She would disturb the silence he had so carefully cultivated. He turned his back on the scene, picked up his brush, and painted a resolute, black C onto the pine board. It was not his concern. He was leaving. But as he worked, he found his gaze drifting back toward the Miller place, where the solitary figure was now pulling a heavy wooden trunk from the back of her wagon, her slight frame straining against the weight. She did not look toward his ranch. She did not seem to notice him at all. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing of all. For 3 days, the silence between the two homesteads remained unbroken. Arthur kept to his routine, mending fences, checking on his small herd of cattle, clearing stones from a field he knew he would never plant. Each time he worked the southern edge of his property, he could see her. Her name, he learned from a passing freighter, was Lin Song. A widow, the man had added with a shrug, who'd bought the deed in Cheyenne. She worked with a tireless, quiet energy that began to wear on Arthur's resolve. He watched her clear the overgrown yard with a small scythe, her gray dress soon smudged with dirt. He saw her patch the leaky roof of the small cabin, climbing a rickety ladder with a bundle of shingle slung over her shoulder. She never stopped moving, from sunup to sundown. She was also, he noted with a grim certainty, running out of water. The pools in the creek bed were gone, baked into cracked mud by the relentless sun. The Miller well was old, its hand pump rusted and prone to seizing. On the 4th morning, he saw her fighting with it. She would work the long handle, her whole body thrown into the effort, and only a trickle of brown water would answer. She would stop, rest her forehead against the cold iron of the pump, and then begin again. Arthur cursed under his breath. He told himself to ignore it. He had his own well, deep and reliable. Her problems were not his. He had a sign to finish. But the image of her, exhausted and alone, fighting that useless pump, lodged itself in his mind. He remembered his first year here, the desperation of a dry well, the feeling of the vast, indifferent land closing in. He threw the hammer he was holding into his toolbox with a clatter of frustration. His plan for a clean, uncomplicated departure was unraveling with every piston stroke she attempted. He strode across the dry grass that separated their properties, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. She heard him coming and stopped, her hand resting on the pump handle. She watched him approach, her face unreadable, her dark eyes wary. She was not afraid, he realized, but she was guarded. "The leather washer's likely dried out," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He stopped a few feet away, gesturing toward the pump. "It won't draw water if it's cracked." She said nothing, simply watched him. Up close, he could see the fatigue etched around her eyes, the fine lines of dust clinging to her skin. Her hands, resting on the iron handle, were not the soft hands of a town woman. They were capable, with callus forming on her palms. "I can fix it," he said, feeling awkward. "Got a spare washer at my place. Won't take long." She considered his offer for a moment. Her gaze was direct, assessing. Then she gave a small, formal nod. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Arthur Vance." "I am Lin Song," she replied, her voice soft, but clear. "Your help is appreciated." He returned with his tools and a new leather washer he'd soaked in oil. As he worked, dismantling the pump mechanism, she stood by, watching not him, but his hands. She anticipated his needs, passing him a wrench or a rag before he had to ask. They worked in a shared silence that was comfortable, efficient. When he finally had the pump reassembled, he primed it with water from his own canteen. He took the handle and began to pump. After a few stiff groans, the mechanism caught. A stream of cool, clear water gushed from the spout, splashing onto the thirsty ground. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, transforming her weary face. "You are a good mechanic, Mr. Vance." "Just a rancher," he said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. But the words felt like a lie, even to him. A rancher wouldn't have noticed the way she'd kept watch on the horizon as they worked, her body relaxed but her eyes alert. A rancher wouldn't have felt the familiar, dangerous stillness settle over him when he'd first crossed the property line. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted the quiet splash of the well water. 3 riders were approaching from the main track, moving with the easy arrogance of men who owned the valley. Arthur recognized the man in the lead instantly. Jebediah Thorne. Thorne was a man who measured his wealth in acres and his power in the fear of smaller men. He ran thousands of head of cattle across the territory, and he had a reputation for absorbing any homestead that stood in the way of his ambition. Thorne reined in his horse a few yards from the well, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He was a big man, his face weathered and ruddy, but his eyes were a pale, cold blue. He ignored Arthur completely, his attention fixed on Lin Song. "Well now," Thorne said, his voice a low drawl that was meant to be charming but was anything but. "Looks like the old Miller place has a new tenant." "Jebediah Thorne. My spread borders yours to the north and west." He tipped his hat, but the gesture was a mockery of politeness. Lin Song did not return the pleasantry. She stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression serene. "I am aware," she said. Thorne's smile tightened. He wasn't used to being met with such composure. This is hard country for a homesteader. Especially for a woman on her own. It takes a lot of water, a lot of grazing land to make a go of it. He gestured vaguely at her small plot. "This little patch won't sustain you through the winter. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. A fair price, of course. Save you a lot of trouble." "The land is not for sale," Lin said, her voice quiet but firm as rock. One of Thorne's men, a lanky youth with a cruel mouth, chuckled. She thinks she's gonna farm this dust bowl. He nudged his horse forward, deliberately crowding her. The animal snorted, tossing its head, and for a second, Arthur thought it would trample the neat rows of seedlings she had painstakingly planted near the cabin. Something inside Arthur, a cold, familiar switch, was flipped. Before he could think, he moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the Colt peacemaker that sat heavy on his hip. He simply stepped between Lynn and the horse, placing himself in the path. He looked at the young rider, his eyes flat and devoid of emotion. "The horse is thirsty," Arthur said, his voice level and dangerously calm. "Maybe you should back him away from the lady's garden." The youth's smirk faltered. He looked from Arthur's face to the warm grip of his pistol, and something he saw there made him swallow hard. He glanced at his boss. Thorne's cold eyes narrowed, finally focusing on Arthur as if seeing him for the first time. He studied the way Arthur stood, balanced on the balls of his feet, his hand hovering naturally near his side. It was not the stance of a rancher. It was the stance of a man who knew what to do with the gun he carried. "Vance," Thorne said, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I thought you were just raising cattle." "I am," Arthur said. "And I find it's easier to do when folks respect property lines." A long, tense silence stretched across the yard. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the drip of water from the newly fixed well. Thorne held Arthur's gaze, a silent battle of wills playing out in the afternoon sun. Finally, Thorne gave a slight jerk of his head. The young rider sullenly backed his horse away. "Just being neighborly," Thorne said, his voice smooth as poison. He turned his gaze back to Lynn. "The offer stands. This land has a way of convincing people when they've made a mistake." With a final, lingering look at Arthur, he wheeled his horse around and, followed by his men, rode away. The dust settled again, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Arthur's heart was pounding, a frantic drumming against his ribs. The coldness was already receding, replaced by a familiar, bitter self-loathing. He had just done the one thing he had sworn he would never do again. He had drawn attention. He had shown his hand. He turned to Lynn's song. He expected to see fear, or perhaps gratitude. Instead, he saw a deep, searching curiosity in her eyes. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the farmer's clothes and the sun-weathered skin. She did not thank him. She simply asked, her voice soft in the sudden quiet, "You are not just a rancher, are you, Mr. Vance?" That evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Arthur saw a light appear in her cabin window for the first time. A little while later, he saw her small figure cross the yard, carrying a covered bowl. He met her at his porch steps, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. He expected questions he didn't want to answer. She held out the bowl. "I made too much," she said simply. It was a lie, and they both knew it. It was a gesture of peace, a payment for the well, for standing with her against Thorne. He took the bowl. It was warm. He gestured to the worn bench on his porch. "Sit for a spell." She hesitated for only a second before accepting. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The bowl on his lap contained steamed rice and some kind of preserved vegetable, savory and unfamiliar. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was filled with the things they hadn't said that afternoon. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My husband, Wei, he bought this land from an agent in Sacramento. He worked on the railroad for 10 years, laying track through the mountains. Every week, he saved a little. He never saw this place. He only saw the map, the lines on the paper that said it was his." Arthur listened, not daring to interrupt the flow of her story. "He said it was a place where a man's work could belong to him. Where we could plant a garden and no one could tell us to leave." She looked out at the dark shape of her own small cabin. "He died in a rockslide 2 months ago. The company gave me his last pay and the deed. Everyone said I should sell it. Go back. But this was his dream." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was laced with steel. I will not let a man like Mr. Thorne take my husband's dream away. She held out a folded, oilskin-wrapped paper. It was the deed. He took it carefully. In the faint lamplight from his window, he could see the official territorial seal and the name, Wei Song, written in a careful, elegant hand. This piece of paper, this dream, was all she had. And she had traveled 1,000 miles to honor it. Her quiet courage shamed him. He had come here to run away, to erase his own past. She had come here to build on one. He handed the deed back to her. Thorne won't stop, he said, his voice low. He sees weakness, and he pushes until it breaks. I am not weak, Mr. Vance, she replied, her gaze steady. I am alone. It is not the same thing. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked down at his own hands, calloused from ranch work but also from the cold, checkered grip of a gun. He had been alone for so long, he had started to think it was the same as being strong. My name isn't really Vance, he heard himself say. The confession slipped out, surprising him as much as it might her. The man I used to be, he was a deputy in a mining town in Colorado. There was a dispute at a saloon. A young man, a boy really, got caught in the middle. He wasn't even involved. I was too slow. Or too fast. I still don't know which. He stared out into the darkness, seeing not the Wyoming plains, but a sawdust-covered floor and a spreading stain of red. I left. Took a new name. Came here thinking if I worked hard enough, I could bury that man. Become someone else. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. Looks like he followed me. She listened patiently, her expression revealing nothing but a deep, somber attention. When he was finished, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply said, the past is a heavy trunk to carry alone. A comfortable silence fell between them again, but this time it was different. It was the quiet of shared truths, of burdens laid down, if only for a moment. He finally took a bite of the food she had brought. The taste was clean, simple, and nourishing. It tasted of a world far from this dusty valley, and yet, it was here, on his porch. The next week passed in a state of tense truce. Thorne and his men kept their distance, but Arthur knew it was temporary. The real attack came not with riders and threats, but with the slow, deliberate malice of a drying creek bed. Thorne had dammed the upper fork of the creek that fed both their properties, diverting the entire flow into his own pastures. It was a common tactic, a legal gray area that was almost impossible to fight. Within days, the trickle of water that ran past their homesteads vanished. Their wells, dependent on the creek to replenish the groundwater, would soon run dry. It was a siege, designed to starve them out without a single shot being fired. Arthur stood at the edge of the dry creek, the cracked earth a testament to Thorne's quiet violence. His first instinct was the old one, ride up to Thorne's ranch, force the issue. But that would lead to guns, and guns would lead back to the man he was trying to bury. Selling his land was no longer an escape, either. To sell now would be to abandon her, to hand Thorne a victory and leave her to face him alone. The thought was impossible. He walked back to his barn and took down the for sale sign. He broke the pine board over his knee, the sharp crack echoing in the still air. He tossed the pieces onto his woodpile. The decision was made. He was no longer leaving. He found Lynn by her well, staring down into the darkness as if she could will the water to rise. He's diverted the creek, Arthur said, stating the obvious. She nodded, her face grim. The water level is already lower. We can't outlast him. Not without water. He expected despair, but her eyes were clear, focused. In my husband's trunk, she said, there are books. He studied maps of this territory. There is a spring in the hills behind your property. It is small, but the book said it is reliable, even in the dry season. Arthur knew the spring she meant. It was more of a seep, miles away, and the land between was rocky and steep. It would take a week to dig an irrigation ditch by hand. We don't have that long. Then we must work faster, she said. That was the beginning of it. They worked side by side, a silent, determined team. He used his plow mule to carve a shallow trench, while she followed with a spade, deepening and clearing it. It was brutal, back-breaking labor under a merciless sun. They spoke little, conserving their energy, communicating with nods and gestures. In the evenings, they would share a meal, too tired to talk, before returning to their separate cabins. He learned about her not from her words, but from her actions. He saw her grit, her refusal to complain, the way she would find a flatter stone to shore up a collapsing section of the ditch without being told. One afternoon, as they stopped for a brief rest in the shade of a lone juniper, she handed him a small, chipped porcelain cup of lukewarm tea from a flask she carried. "My father used to say that a mountain is moved one stone at a time," she said, her gaze on the long, winding scar they were carving into the earth. "Your father was a patient man," Arthur replied, his muscles aching. "He was a farmer," she said with a small smile. "It is the same thing." In that small moment of shared tea and quiet reflection, Arthur felt something shift inside him. The loneliness that had haunted his life here was gone. In its place was a sense of purpose, a feeling of partnership that was as new to him as it was profound. He wasn't just digging a ditch to save his ranch, he was fighting for her husband's dream, for the quiet decency she represented in a world run by men like Thorne. Their work was interrupted by the arrival of the territorial sheriff, a portly, sweating man named Dawes who clearly wished he were anywhere else. With him was one of Thorne's foremen. Dawes cleared his throat and unrolled a document with an official-looking seal. "Arthur Vance?" "Mrs. Song," he began, avoiding their eyes. "Got a legal notice here. It's a claim dispute. Mr. Thorne has filed a motion with the territorial court. Seems he has a prior deed to this entire section, including both your parcels. Says the survey was in error." Arthur knew it was a lie. It was a forged document, a legal maneuver meant to tie them up in court until they were broke and beaten. The judge in this territory was firmly in Thorne's pocket. "You have 30 days to file a response in Cheyenne," Dawes mumbled, handing the paper to Arthur. "Otherwise, the claim reverts to Mr. Thorne by default." He tipped his hat and couldn't get away fast enough. The paper felt heavy in Arthur's hand, heavier than any gun. Thorne had escalated the fight. He had moved it from the land to the law, a place where Arthur had no skill and no power. This, he thought, was the end. They could never make it to Cheyenne and back, let alone hire a lawyer. He looked over at Lynn. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold fire. She looked at the fraudulent notice, then back at him. She was not defeated. She was thinking. "There is a telegraph office in Dusty Creek, is there not?" she asked, her voice sharp and clear. "My husband's cousin, he is a clerk for the Central Pacific offices in Sacramento. He reads English very well. He understands paper and law." She took a steadying breath. "Mr. Thorne believes he is the only one with powerful friends. He may be mistaken." 3 months later, the autumn rains had come, turning the valley from a dusty brown to a hopeful green. The creek, which Thorne had been strongly advised to unblock by a visiting U.S. Marshal, now flowed freely between the two properties. The irrigation ditch they had dug together was no longer a desperate measure, but a useful channel that watered both her thriving garden and a new hayfield for his cattle. The telegraph had been their salvation. A carefully worded message from Lynn to her cousin had set in motion a series of events Thorne had not anticipated. The Central Pacific Railroad, it turned out, took a very dim view of land fraud, especially when it involved deeds they had helped secure for their own workers. An inquiry from a federal office in Sacramento to the territorial marshal had a chilling effect on the local judge's enthusiasm for Thorne's case. The claim dispute vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Jebediah Thorne, it was rumored, was now facing his own set of legal troubles regarding certain land grants he had acquired from the railroad under questionable circumstances. He no longer rode by their homesteads. The fence that had once separated Arthur's land from the old Miller place was now gone, taken down post by post to be used for a new, larger corral they had built together. His cattle grazed freely on her pasture. Her chickens scratched in the dirt by his barn. Their lives had become intertwined, their work a single, shared effort. The for sale sign was now kindling, long since burned in his stove. The life he had been so desperate to escape was gone, replaced by something he had never thought to look for. One evening, he sat on his porch, cleaning a rifle, the familiar weight of it comforting in his hands. He no longer saw it as a symbol of the man he had been, but as a tool, a responsibility for the life he now had. Lynn came and sat on the steps, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. They often spent their evenings this way, in a comfortable silence punctuated by the small sounds of domestic work. "The garden has done well," she said, her fingers moving deftly. "We will have enough to store for the winter. And more besides. I'll take the extra to town next week," he said. "We can use the money for more seed in the spring." He looked at her, at the way the lamplight softened the lines of her face. He thought of the first time he had seen her, a small, solitary figure in a grey dress, standing against the vast emptiness of this land. He had seen a problem, a complication to his escape. He had been so wrong. She had not been an obstacle. She had been the destination. The quiet strength he had mistaken for fragility was the bedrock upon which they had both built this new life. He had come to this valley seeking an ending, a place to forget who he was. But in the quiet courage of his neighbor, in the shared work of their hands, he had found something else entirely, a beginning. He had discovered that a man doesn't need to outrun his past. He just needs a better reason to stand his ground. And as he watched her work, her hands creating life from the stubborn soil, he knew he had found his reason. If you enjoyed the story of Arthur and Lynn, you might enjoy our tale of a lone school teacher who uncovers a town's dangerous secret. Be sure to subscribe for more stories from the American West.